Hello, all. Good morning. Welcome to Free Speech in Schools in American History, Culture, and Society. My name is Kristen Treverdian, and I'm the Senior Manager of Free Expression and Education at PEN America. PEN America stands at the intersection of literature and human rights to protect free expression in the United States and worldwide. We're a 100-year-old organization that champions the freedom to write, recognizing the power of the word to transform the world. Our mission is to unite writers and their allies to celebrate creative expression and defend liberties that make it possible. Our strength is our membership, a nationwide community of novelists, journalists, nonfiction writers, editors, poets, essayists, playwrights, publishers, translators, scholars, and other writing professionals, as well as devoted readers and supporters who join with them to carry out PEN America's mission. You can find more about our events, advocacy efforts, and about joining PEN America at pen.org. Free speech has become a flashpoint for controversy on campuses across the U.S. PEN America is a national leader in fighting educational censorship in both higher ed and K-12. PEN America partners with schools, colleges, and professional organizations to facilitate workshops, convenings, advisory panels, public events, and educational programs. Through our professional development programs and our campaigns against educational gag orders, we work to bridge divides on campuses and to defend students and teachers against legislative infringements on free expression in the classroom. Today's event is the fifth in a year-long series entitled Flashpoints, Free Speech in American History, Culture, and Society. The series is presented by PEN America in partnership with the American Historical Association and made possible by a major grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities. The series is timed to mark PEN America's 100th anniversary. In addition to the live events, digital resources will be available to educators and the public for years to come. You can watch previous events on PEN America's website, and we have our final event coming up in April in Tulsa, Oklahoma. We're thrilled that you are all able to join us this morning for what I know will be an engaging and robust conversation about American democratic society. We are grateful to our moderator, Brendan Gillis, and our panelists, Justin Driver and Natalia Melman-Petrozella. Unfortunately, our third panelist, John Zimmerman, is unable to join us today. Brendan Gillis is the Manager of Teaching and Learning at the American Historical Association and an Assistant Professor of History at Lamar University in Beaumont, Texas. His teaching and scholarship focus on cultural histories of law, politics, and local government in colonial North America and the British Empire. In his work at the AHA, Dr. Gillis advocates on behalf of history educators, promoting innovative pedagogy, contesting restrictions on academic freedom, and supporting efforts to teach history honestly. Before our panel begins, we're going to take a listen back to a 1969 Supreme Court decision, Tinker v. Des Moines. In 1965, 3 students in Des Moines were suspended from school for wearing black armbands as a silent protest against the Vietnam War. They took their case all the way to the Supreme Court, and in 1969, the justices ruled 7-2 in favor of the students. Here's an excerpt from that decision, read by Nikolai McKenzie. Thank you.
Thanks, Kristen. Good morning, everybody. First Amendment rights, applied in light of the special characteristics of the school environment, are available to teachers and students. It can hardly be argued that either students or teachers shed their constitutional rights to freedom of speech or expression at the schoolhouse gate. This has been the unmistakable holding of this court for almost 50 years. In West Virginia State Board of Education versus Barnett, this court held that under the First Amendment, the student in public school may not be compelled to salute the flag. Speaking through Mr. Justice Jackson, the court said, "The 14th Amendment, as now applied to states, protects the citizen against the state itself and all of its creatures, boards of education not accepted. These have, of course, important, delicate, and highly discretionary functions, but none that they may not perform within the limits of the Bill of Rights. That they are educating the young for citizenship is reason for scrupulous protection of constitutional freedoms of the individual, if we are not to strangle the free mind at its source and teach youth to discount important principles of our government as mere platitudes. On the other hand, the court has repeatedly emphasized the need for affirming the comprehensive authority of the states and of school officials, consistent with fundamental constitutional safeguards, to prescribe and control conduct in the schools. Our problem lies in the area where students in the exercise of First Amendment rights collide with the rules of school authorities. The problem posed by the present case does not relate to regulation of the length of skirts or the type of clothing, to hairstyle or deportment. It does not concern aggressive, disruptive action or even group demonstrations. Our problem involves direct, primary First Amendment rights akin to pure speech. The school officials banned and sought to punish petitioners for a silent, passive expression of opinion, unaccompanied by any disorder or disturbance on the part of petitioners. There is here no evidence whatever of petitioners' interference, actual or nascent, with the school's work, or of collision with the rights of other students to be secure and to be let alone. Accordingly, this case does not concern speech or action that intrudes upon the work of the schools or the rights of other students. The district court concluded that the action of the school authorities was reasonable because it was based upon their fear of a disturbance from the wearing of armbands. But in our system, undifferentiated fear or oppression of disturbance is not enough to overcome the right to freedom of expression. Any departure from absolute regimentation may cause trouble. Any variation from the majority's opinion may inspire fear. Any word spoken in class, in the lunchroom, or on the campus that deviates from the views of another person may start an argument or cause a disturbance. But our Constitution says we must take this risk, and our history says that it is this sort of hazardous freedom, this kind of openness, that is the basis of our national strength and of the independence and vigor of Americans who grow up and live in this relatively permissive, often disputatious society. In our system, state-operated schools may not be enclaves of totalitarianism. School officials do not possess absolute authority over their students. Students in school, as well as out of school, are persons under our Constitution. They are possessed of fundamental rights which the state must respect, just as they themselves must respect their obligations to the state. In our system, students may not be regarded as closed-circuit recipients of only that which the state chooses to communicate. They may not be confined to the expression of those sentiments that are officially approved. In the absence of a specific showing of constitutionally valid reasons to regulate their speech, students are entitled to freedom of expression of their views. As Judge Guin, speaking for the Fifth Circuit Court, said, school officials cannot suppress expressions of feelings which they do not wish to contend. With which they do not wish to contend. This principle has been repeated by the court of numerous occasions during the intervening years. In Kiyishian versus Board of Regents, Mr. Justice Brennan, speaking of the court, said, "The vigilant protection of constitutional freedoms is nowhere more vital than in the community of American schools. The classroom is peculiarly a marketplace of ideas. The nation's future depends upon leaders trained through wide exposure to that robust exchange of ideas, which discovers truth out of a multitude of tongues, rather than through any kind of authoritative selection." Under our Constitution, free speech is not a right that is given only to be circumscribed, that it exists in principle, but not in fact. Freedom of expression would not truly exist if the right could be exercised only in an area that a benevolent government has provided as a safe haven for crackpots. The Constitution says that Congress and the states may not abridge the right to free speech. The provision means what it says. We properly read it to permit reasonable regulation of speech-connected activities in carefully restricted circumstances, but we do not confine the permissible exercise of First Amendment rights to a telephone booth or the four corners of a pamphlet or to supervised and ordained discussion in a school classroom. As we have discussed, the record does not demonstrate any facts which might reasonably have led school authorities to forecast substantial disruption of or material interference with school activities. And no disturbances or disorders on the school premises in fact occurred. These petitioners merely went about their ordained rounds at school. Their deviation consisted only in wearing on their sleeve a band of black cloth not more than 2 inches wide. They wore it to exhibit their disapproval of the Vietnam hostilities and their advocacy of a truce, to make their views known and, by their example, to influence others to adopt them. They neither interrupted school activities nor sought to intrude in the school affairs or the lives of others. They caused discussion outside of the classrooms, but no interference with work and no disorder. In the circumstances, our Constitution does not permit officials of the state to deny their form of expression. Thank you.
Hello, and welcome to PEN America and the AHA's panel on free speech and schools in American history. My name is Brendan Gillis, and I'm the manager of teaching and learning at the American Historical Association. And as such, this question, free speech in schools, is one that is of great interest to me personally and professionally. And I expect that's why so many of you have chosen to join us today. Thank you. We are thrilled to have with us two distinguished scholars, each with their own research that illuminates Americans grappling with free speech and schools. Let's dig in. Each panelist will share a flashpoint from history with us before we dive into deeper questions. And just a note on format, we will save time for a Q&A with the audience at the end. So please hold on to your questions. We'll solicit them a little bit later. Let us begin. First, Justin Driver is the Robert R. Slaughter Professor of Law and Counselor to the Dean at Yale Law School. He teaches and writes in the area of constitutional law and is the author of The Schoolhouse Gate, Public Education, the Supreme Court, and the Battle for the American Mind. Mr. Driver, Justin, we just heard an excerpt from Tinker v. Des Moines, a 1969 Supreme Court decision involving student speech. Can you explain that case to us and why it matters?
Yeah, absolutely. First, I'm so delighted to be here with you all today to talk about student speech. It's an urgent topic, especially these days. So I thought I would talk, before I speak about Tinker more in depth, about the book that I've written, which sort of adds some context here. The book is called The Schoolhouse Gate, whose name is drawn from Tinker, right? This is the resonant line that we just heard. It can hardly be argued that students shed their constitutional rights at the schoolhouse gate. And the book attempts to examine the intersection of two fundamentally American institutions, the public school on the one hand and the Supreme Court on the other. And the core claim of the book is that it's difficult, if not impossible, to understand the one institution without thinking about the other. And so with respect to the public school, we don't often or always think about public schools as being legal institutions. Nevertheless, when one steps back and canvasses the broad array of constitutional rights that have been found to exist in public schools, it becomes clear that those are legal institutions in some significant sense. And then, with respect to the Supreme Court, it seems to me that when you examine student cases, that it becomes clear what the Supreme Court can do. That is to say, its capacity for resisting majoritarian impulses is most clear in the public schools. And so one of the reasons I talk about the book is that what I'm trying to do here is suggest that the disputes that involve students offer an excellent prism for examining U.S. history over the last 100 years, and that the cultural anxieties that exist in our larger nation come into focus most clearly within the schoolhouse gate. Indeed, the recent sort of controversy over trans students and access to restrooms, that sort of reached its boiling point, it seems to me, most intensely within the school context. So going back to Tinker. So we have to think about December of 1965, when exactly, as we heard, we have 3 students, including Mary Beth Tinker and John Tinker, wearing black armbands to school in order to protest the Vietnam War. And it's an open question as to whether this is legitimate. Indeed, when school officials get wind of this idea, they say, oh no, that is too hot of a topic. And they say with some force that we lost a student over in Vietnam, a graduate of this school died. And he still has friends who are here. And when you wear these black armbands, his buddies are going to take you as dishonoring his memory and his sacrifice for this nation. And so in order to keep the peace, you all need to not wear your armbands. There were suggestions that there may be counter armbands, rainbow-colored armbands, and this would just be, sort of too controversial of a move. And one of the things I try to do in the book is to put a spotlight on the individual families and the students. Sometimes lawyers just think about these cases as involving abstractions and, just Supreme Court justices handing these declarations down from on high. But there are real individuals here who demonstrated, it seems to me, uncommon amounts of courage in order to stand up and vindicate their constitutional principles. The Tinkers were standing up not only against the school officials, but also their surrounding community. And, as punishment, in effect, for daring to deviate from the dominant view, the Tinker household was assaulted in the sense that people were making harassing phone calls, and lots of letters were sent to the Tinker household saying that they were raising these bad children. And the front door of the Tinker household was defaced. Someone threw a bucket of red paint on the front door. The suggestion would be that only a communist, a red, would dare to oppose the Vietnam War. And so this case makes its way to the Supreme Court of the United States. It's not decided until 1969, but again, the protest happens in 1965, and many in this room know that this is long before mass mobilization against the Vietnam War. The idea of speaking out was sort of incomprehensible. You don't love your country. That would have been the dominant view. So Justice Fortas writes this, a very important opinion, finding for the first time that students have the ability to offer, their affirmative views. And he says, very importantly, that when students are talking, that's not some sort of distraction, but instead that is a vital part of the educational process itself. And Fortas says that there's sort of a clamor that exists, right? And we hear Tocqueville in the background there. There's an often disputatious society, we just heard. And so that's one of the things that makes the United States is a respect for the freedom of speech. It's a very important opinion. It goes far, it didn't go quite far enough in my view, The test that lawyers hear with Tinker, lawyers are distilling things into sort of very concise tests. And the question is whether it's permissible for educators to punish students if there is a reasonable forecast of a substantial disruption. Those are sort of the most famous words for lawyers, a reasonable forecast of a substantial disruption. The problem with that is that it opens the door to a heckler's veto. This is a term that the great Harry Calvin introduced, Professor Calvin of the University of Chicago. That's the basic idea that a particularly sensitive listener can, if he objects vociferously enough, shut down otherwise legitimate speech. And so if students had, sort of beaten up the Tinkers, right, and said, you're wearing that black armband, I'm not going to have it, and caused a commotion, then it would have been permissible to shut down the speech. As it turns out, the Supreme Court of the United States offered a somewhat sanitized version of the events. There were sort of greater controversies than the Supreme Court let on. So this is a really momentous decision. The famous line is that it can hardly be argued that students shed their constitutional rights at the schoolhouse gate, but the argument was made at the Supreme Court. Justice Hugo Black issued a blistering dissenting opinion. So it was a 7-2 decision. It may seem sort of obvious and axiomatic that this was the only way that the decision could have come out. It's not so. Justice Black felt so strongly about the opinion that he decided to read his dissent from the bench. Typically, justices just print their dissent in the U.S. reports, but so reading signals unusual disagreement. He spoke for 20 minutes, and he said, "I want it thoroughly known that I disclaim any sentence, any word, any part of what the Supreme Court does today." And the concern was about permissiveness. Right? Justice Black would say, there are men with long hair these days, the college campuses, there's lots of unrest, including at Columbia University and SDS, and this is going to trickle down to the high schools, and so we better sort of, draw the line here. He got so worked up that Chief Justice Warren said old Hugo really got caught up in his jockstrap on that one, And some people suggest that one of the reasons if he did get caught up in his jockstrap is because of an event from his personal life. Hugo Black had a grandson who produced an underground newspaper back in the day, and the school suspended him. It was critical of school administrators. And Hugo Black wrote his daughter-in-law a note saying, the school did exactly the right thing here, and if you try to stand up for your rights, there's going to be trouble. The school, the nation is going to, sort of hell in a handbasket, and you better not do anything about this. This is an irresistible story for people who write about Tinker, and I include it in my book. It is, however, misleading to view Black's statement as merely one grandfather's sort of fit of pique. And if you were forced to say whose views resonated more with Americans in the 1960s, it would have been those of Justice Black, not those of Justice Fortas. I found polling data from Harris taken only 1 month after the Tinker decision was handed down, and they asked whether students should have the right to do protests and to sort of assert themselves, and a majority of Americans said no. And so this is a testament, again, to the way that the Supreme Court can vindicate, the rights of our dissidents in American society. So thanks for that. No.
Never miss an excuse for applause. Natalia Melman-Petrozella is a historian of contemporary American politics and culture. She also writes frequently for various kinds of publications in different media, and she's also a podcaster. She is the author of Classroom Wars, Language, Sex, and the Making of Modern Political Culture, and Fit Nation, The Gains and Pains of America's Exercise Obsession. She is an associate professor of history at the New School. Ms. Petrozella, Natalia, In your Classroom Wars research, you discussed the controversy over teaching sex education in public schools in the late 1960s, particularly in California. Can you share those battles with us and discuss how they shaped the national conversation around discourse in schools?
Yes, I can. And thank you for that kind introduction. And, you know, we didn't really talk much about our comments beforehand, but I'm like scrolling because so much actually is just so resonant. I'm actually going to take us back to 1965 as well. And, you know, it's really hard, as you all know, if you're in this room, to draw these big conclusions or generalizations about American schools, because if we do have one defining characteristic of our school system, it's that it is fiercely local, right? So especially absent a Supreme Court decision or, you know, a kind of big piece of policy, it can be really hard to say, well, this was happening in this school, so therefore it's happening more broadly. So bear with me as I do try to make some generalizations, but I'll explain why I am doing so. So I want to take us back to the world that I studied for this book, Classroom Wars, which was California in the 1960s. And when I came to that research, I really wanted to say something bigger about schools than what one kind of local study might reveal. But for the reasons I said, it's hard to do that. California in the 60s, though, is a really kind of evocative place to look at educational politics more broadly. There are a range of reasons for this. One is that, to paraphrase one educational scholar, he said, well, in the 60s in California, you know, it was so innovative and vital at that time that an idea would be in the educational journals, you know, one day, and 3 months later, you'd actually see it in classrooms. And so it was this place where new ideas were coming about. And because of that, it was also somewhere where, depending on people's politics, they looked to California schools either with a sense of foreboding or excitement about what was coming down the pipeline. And the last piece I'll say about California schools is that it also was an exceptionally unified bureaucracy at that time. Lots of individual kind of variation, but there really was a pretty strong central educational bureaucracy, and the head of it for most of the 1960s is a guy named Max Rafferty, who also was a big loudmouth, so he was writing about it all the time and on the radio and became a national figure. So that allows me, I think, to go to California and to make some broader claims about what it represented. So let's go to 1965, the same year. So 1965, there is a sex education curriculum that is rolled out in a few districts in Southern California. The one I look at in most detail in here is in Anaheim, California, but there were ones like this in other places. It's called Family Life and Sex Education, perhaps out of a sense that just sex education would cause controversy, as it did, and it's approved with like 90% of the district's parents saying, yes, we want this curriculum. It goes on without much controversy for a couple of years. In 1968, when the political environment is changing dramatically, both protests over the war, the sexual revolution, the kind of impact of the 1965 Immigration Act is especially felt in Southern California, things really began to change. Opposition to this sex ed program really coalesces, and coalesces both locally and in terms of bringing national media attention to Anaheim and to other districts. So what did that look like? Well, some of that attention, I mean, this curriculum made the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, Look magazine, which was a big deal at that time. A Village Voice reporter moved there for a year to cover this controversy. It's a great read. It's called Oh, Sex Education by a woman named Mary Breasted. But anyway, so it gets all of this attention, and I think one of the things that's really worth focusing on is first the opposition to the program, almost before we look at the curriculum, because almost no one who was opposing this curriculum in the pages of national media was actually reading the curriculum. Might sound familiar to some current dynamics. What was the problem with family life and sex education? It was promoting communism. It was transgressing or trespassing on the rights of parents to teach children about sex or to remain completely silent on this issue. It was part of a globalist plot, which was also evident in the World Health Organization, which was aiming to tell children and adults how to take care of their bodies. it was wrong, these opponents said, to think that any mention of sexuality at school could be construed as something other than sex instruction. So, whereas, talk about speech, the proponents of this program, who were school nurses and educators and other health professionals, were very careful to call this family life and sex education. It is called in almost every tract, and there were many of them, sex instruction. And, you know, if you go deep into these and share a lot of them on social media, you see that one of the big fears here is that kids will be taught all of this lascivious content, but also conditioned into a kind of moral relativism, which will allow them to abandon their parents' value system and to be vulnerable to just become slaves to their own sexual desire and then to become tools of a globalist communist plot. This is, my students look at me when I say this and they're like, is she okay? I'm like, I have the documents, I really do. So this was the nature of the discourse. If you look at this stuff, some of the documents that maybe have crossed your mind, there's a pamphlet called Is the Schoolhouse the Place to Teach Raw Sex, which publishes about 1 million copies, and another book which became a popular audio recording called The Child Seducers, which is read by Michael Carradine, actually. You can listen to it on YouTube. So it's worth asking, as many people did not at the time, what was actually in this curriculum. So I went back, I found this curriculum, and even by the standards of the late 1960s, it's pretty moderate. Most of these curricula are effectively marriage education curricula where, they'll take kids from learning about basic biology of reproduction up to planning a family budget once you get married. I mean, this is the nature of a lot of these curricula. It is, however, scientific rather than moral in the instruction that is provided in most of these curricula. But I do really want to make a case that it was radical that any of this material was being discussed with students at school. I don't want to turn my nose up too much at, how could these, priggish people be so exercised about this. It really was a big deal to have these conversations at all. And I draw on the work of Janice Irvine here, historical sociologist who's done great work on this. But when I, as a historian, wanted to figure out, well, what did this really mean to children and the people who were living in these communities at the time, I hit archival gold. That I went into the local history room and the archivist produces, literally blows off the dust, a box of classroom evaluations of one of these courses from 1968. I still get chills thinking about it. And so I started reading them, and what was remarkable about them is the way that some of these students commented on speech. So one student says in there, and this is a girl writing, "I'm so happy that we talked about necking, because if I didn't know what it could lead to, I could have been ruined. It was too late for some of my friends." So there, sit with that for a second, and I'll give you one other example, where another student, a boy, says, "We talked about homosexuality for the first time. I'm so glad to learn about this so that we can help these diseased people." So to me, this was such a remarkable find in terms of what it meant to introduce a program where the curriculum, which again, I can't emphasize it enough, nobody was really reading the curriculum before they were kind of, launching these big attacks on it, where the curriculum seemed really quite moderate, even by the mores of the day, for sure, but the speech itself was really a big deal in terms of bringing these topics into the schoolhouse. But what was being articulated in that speech was also a rather retrograde vision, right? This was holding up very traditional ideas about young girls being ruined if their virtue is lost, and homosexuality being an illness, which still was categorized as at that time for a few more years. But I think that is really important to think about. I want to, close up these initial comments here before we get to the larger conversation to say that, with culture wars talk, and my book is called Classroom Wars, so I'm guilty of these martial metaphors as well. The question is always like, well, who won, right? And I think that the real interesting answer to that comes when we look at the question of speech. Because what conservatives were fighting for at this time was silence. They were saying none of this should be articulated at all. I don't care if you're saying homosexuals are sick, like, don't talk about this at school. They lost that battle in an enormous way because, in part due to their own effort, the can was sort of opened, or the cat was out of the bag in terms of talking about sexuality at school. However, I would say, especially thinking about where we are today, but even apparently very soon after these debates, and certainly into the abstinence-only movement of the 1980s, 90s, and onward, that in many ways they won in terms of the kind of versions of kind of sexuality and sexual identity that were promoted at school. And I'll just end with another, I think, evocative example where, school board meetings, much like today, were absolutely packed in discussing these curricula. And in one, there are some students who actually show up, and one student is advocating for keeping this curriculum, a viewpoint that was in a lot of the student newspapers as well. And this mother, who was part of the antis, who wants to shut it all down, gets up and yells at the kid, "You shut up, I bet you're not even a virgin anyway." And I mean, to me, this idea that none of these, this was an uncontroversial curriculum until this opposition began. It was the opposition that brought so many more people into this really kind of vital, but certainly loud debate about the morality and the propriety of discussing sexuality in schools. So I'll stop there, but yes, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for two fascinating flashpoints. Before I open up and start asking some more questions, I want to ask each of our presenters about another dimension of this flashpoint they've introduced. First off, in the reading from Tinker v. Des Moines that we heard earlier, there was a reference to an earlier Supreme Court case, the West Virginia v. Barnett in 1943. And just as an aside, as a legal historian, I think we should probably have more public readings of Supreme Court decisions. That was pretty great. West Virginia v. Barnett sort of defined some of the extant case law at the time of the Tinker decision. And so I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about that decision and how that relates to this question of free speech in schools.
Happy to do so, and it really does follow quite nicely from what we just heard, in the sense that the first case that I spoke about was Tinker, thinking about the right of students to speak up, and here we're thinking about actually the right to remain silent, and the Barnett decision grows out of Charleston, West Virginia, where there are two sisters, the Barnett sisters, who are Jehovah's Witnesses, and they wish not to recite the Pledge of Allegiance. And they view it as a violation of their religious faith. They regard it as worshiping a graven image. And the question is whether they can remain silent while their classmates are reciting the Pledge of Allegiance. West Virginia had just enacted a statewide statute compelling people to recite the Pledge of Allegiance upon penalty of being expelled from school. And there was a prior decision from just a few years earlier called the Gobitis decision that upheld the constitutionality of these measures. And a very distressing dynamic occurred where, in the aftermath of the Gobitis decision from 1940, these measures spread all around the country. It was a relatively isolated phenomenon where people were expelling Jehovah's Witnesses. They existed in only 15 states in 1940. But in the aftermath, it spread to all 48 states. There was also violence against Jehovah's Witnesses that some people traced to the Supreme Court decision itself. They thought of the Supreme Court as announcing that Jehovah's Witnesses are traitors and sort of ran people out of town. And so it may have looked bleak for the Barnett sisters when their case made its way to the Supreme Court in 1943. They did prevail, though. One of the reasons it would have seemed bleak is that you have to remember this is at the height of World War II, right? Patriotic sentiment is running incredibly high. Sort of stores in New York City couldn't keep the flag stocked. It was, selling at such a rapid rate. Nevertheless, the Supreme Court of the United States vindicated the right of the Barnett sisters. It was a really interesting opinion by Justice Jackson, probably the greatest writer on the Supreme Court in its history. And he did a very interesting thing where he reconceptualized the right. During the Gobitis decision, it was viewed as sort of, the free exercise of religion, also part of the First Amendment. Did this requiring Jehovah's Witnesses violate their free exercise rights? Jackson very subtly says, well, this isn't really so much about religion as it is about speech. And that the freedom of speech, he says, has a corollary negative right, the freedom not to speak. And so it is a violation of the First Amendment, Jackson finds, in order to require these students to speak. Jackson, as I said, is just a magnificent writer. And he says, one of my favorite lines in all of the U.S. reports, he says, if there's any fixed star in our constitutional constellation, it is that no official, high or petty, can prescribe what shall be orthodox, right? If there's anything that is, sort of the central point, he says, in effect, you can't make people say things. And there are some folks, including Chris Eisgruber, now the president of Princeton, who says that in his own way, we can understand Jackson as appealing to patriotism as he issues this decision by saying a fixed star, and that he's perhaps invoking the stars on the American flag to say that, in effect, it is un-American, to use a very charged term, to require people to pledge allegiance to the United States. It's a really important decision, and one that remains with us today because there are teachers who periodically will say to students who were inspired by Colin Kaepernick, who say, I wish not to recite the Pledge of Allegiance, who say, you must. And that is incorrect. I mean, I had lots of audiences when I was writing this book, but one of the audiences is absolutely teachers, who may be curious about the Constitution, but find the subject somewhat imposing. And I tried to write the book in a way that would be accessible to non-lawyers, because it's important for all Americans, teachers to be, and non-teachers, and just ordinary Americans to be aware of our students' constitutional rights. And I hoped that by writing this, it would raise the awareness of some of these issues and prevent teachers from violating their students' constitutional rights.
Thank you. Natalia, I asked Justin to look backwards from the 1960s and think about a longer history of speech. I was wondering if you could push us in the other direction and think about how some of the issues that you addressed in Classroom Wars played out over the subsequent decades.
Absolutely. So I'll start by not quite going backwards, but remaining in this moment of the 60s for a second. One thing which I think is relevant to realize is that, and can be easy to forget when a lot of the way we do historical research on education is sort of narrowly about one curricular issue or another. Sometimes we have good reasons for doing that, but one thing that was remarkable about looking at sex education is how connected it was to concerns over other curricula. So, in a very concrete example of that, Ronald Reagan was governor of California at the time that this was all going on, and he looked at this drama over sex education, and he said, the fact that these programs are popping up in schools all over this state, this is evocative of the moral decay into which we are descending. We need to stop it right now. And he was connecting it also to, protests on campuses, Berkeley, et cetera. And so he convenes this Moral Guidelines Committee. And the Moral Guidelines Committee was so interesting because it came out of sex education, but seamlessly connected this to the move to teach social studies instead of teaching a sort of more linear progress narrative of history. Some of you might know what MAN, A Course of Study was. It was a kind of very innovative social studies curriculum that was seen to be un-American. It was connected to what they saw as, putting too much emphasis on teaching evolution. So there was this real connection to other curricular issues in a way that I think is really relevant today. So moving forward, I mean, it would be boring to kind of do a timeline, but to this point that I made earlier about conservatives losing the battle on like whether you could talk about sex with kids at school or not, I definitely think that they lost, but I think it's really interesting if you look at the ensuing decades to think about what kind of speech was sort of amplified or legitimized or embraced by conservatives. And of course, a big shift or a big win is totally not the wrong word here, but a significant development was the HIV/AIDS crisis of the 1980s, where in many ways this bolsters conservatives' mission to say that if you talk about if you talk about sex with kids at school, then the appropriate way to frame that is like, this is a decision that could kill you, right? And that is really tied up, in this case, with the immorality of homosexuality. So I think that's a really important development that happens in the 1980s then and 90s. Today, I think it's really interesting, to kind of bring this back to the legal angle, which Justin is emphasizing on. One thing that was notable about these fights over sex ed at the time is there was almost no legal dimension to them. These were grassroots fights. They were, yes, there's local policy that's enacted. There are a few kind of showcase laws that go nowhere, like you can't use CECUS materials in California classrooms, but there's not national policy over this. Now, or even really statewide policy, if you look at, the Don't Say Gay legislation and other things that are coming out of Texas, you really see how kind of limitations on certain kinds of sexual speech with children are being encoded into law in a way that I think both represents a continuation of the kind of activism that we saw on the ground then, but also a new and I think pretty pernicious direction.
Thank you. One of the things that I love about putting your research side by side is that it invites us to think about free speech in terms of constitutional law, a place which is pretty obvious to go to think about free speech, but also as something that is defined in a wider cultural context. And so to really delve into how free speech looks differently in these two realms, I think it'd be really helpful if we could step back and address the question behind this panel. So, how is freedom of speech defined differently in schools than everywhere else? And this is for both of you.
Yeah, so it's a very important question. Students typically enjoy what I think of as junior varsity constitutional rights. Okay, so and it's important that we say students rather than minors, because when minors are in the public park across the street after school, their free speech rights are typically coextensive with the rights of people who have reached the age of majority. But when they enter the school, they receive somewhat diminished constitutional protections. So that is the fundamental dynamic that exists not only with respect to free speech, but also a host of other constitutional rights, including Fourth Amendment protection against search and seizures and other things of that nature. The court itself has wrestled quite recently with the notion of what the schoolhouse gate even means in the modern age in an important case decided a couple of years ago by the Supreme Court out of Pennsylvania involving a young woman called Brandy Levy, who we can think of as the vulgar cheerleader, right, who was dismissed from the varsity cheerleading team and, cut to be a junior varsity cheerleader. And she expressed her frustration on a Snapchat, and she used a vulgarity to express her emotions. This was off campus on a Saturday afternoon at a local convenience store, and one of her friends sort of took a screenshot, right? Snapchat messages, as I understand it, are meant to disappear, but the internet never forgets, right? And showed it to a coach, and so Brandy Levy was excused, and I should say suspended from the team for an entire year. And it was, it was an off-campus incident, but people would say it had the ability to affect what happens inside of the school. And so, because so much of teenage speech does happen online, drawing the borders here is very awkward and raises difficult questions. The Supreme Court in that case, the Brandy Levy case, did find that the school acted unconstitutionally and sort of violated her free speech rights. And it was Justice Breyer who wrote the opinion for the court, and he had a wonderful phrase where he says, "America's public schools are nurseries of democracy." Really evocative, and I've had the privilege of being a law clerk for Justice Breyer. I think that will be the most sort of single memorable line that he contributed in his decade-long career. It was the first victory for a free speech claim since the Tinker decision of the 1960s. The student speech had been on a long losing streak at the Supreme Court of the United States, including involving a student case involving a guy called Matthew Frazier, who gave a sexual innuendo in the 1980s that was inspired by the old television show Three's Company, one of my favorite television shows as a kid growing up. And there was a case called Bong Hits for Jesus as well, decided in 2007, dealing with pro-drug speech that the Supreme Court, in my view, wrongly dismissed. So this was a momentous decision saying that students, that the ability of schools to censor students for off-campus speech was not boundless.
I want to add to that and say that, this is not a legal argument I'm making, but one more about lived experience in classroom culture. One of the things, it's hard if you study classrooms, particularly historically, sometimes we call them black boxes because it's so hard. Even with those student evaluations I found, it's so hard to know how something really went down inside a classroom. And I think one of the relevant things to think about in answering your very good question about how freedom of speech is defined differently in schools is that because of the peculiar and intense dynamics of power and social pressure that exist in classrooms, like freedom of speech might be guaranteed in a JV way or in a not even totally JV way for kids, but what you feel you can and can't say, depending on the way your teacher sets things up, is really relevant there. And I think that that's something that we should think about and really is applicable across the political spectrum because our classrooms are so diverse. The second thing I want to say, and I hesitate even to say it because I think it could take us in a really different direction, but I think is relevant, is that, a turn in educational circles to think about the emotional impact of speech in classrooms, and I think often to use the word harm a little too loosely in thinking about the impact of speech, has real implications for this. And some of them are probably very good, I think, but some of them, if we're talking about the importance of deliberation and the contestation and everything that was so beautifully spelled out in Tinker, if we are elevating the avoidance of harm as a prime kind of classroom objective, that's going to have an effect on this discourse about free speech.
I think bringing up harm freedom of speech for students is defined quite differently than freedom of speech for teachers. What do you make of that distinction? And how has that affected the way in which freedom of speech has played out as an issue in schools?
Do you want to go?
You go
I'm happy to go
first,
first. Okay. Wonderful question. The court in recent years has been relatively hostile to teacher speech, offered little protection. There's a case from a few years ago called Garcetti versus Ceballos, which deals with public employee speech that offers a very anemic conception of what teachers can say. And if you talk to teachers, they are petrified of, sort of what for their free speech rights, including, on social media and things of this nature. So it's a very, alarming time. There was a recent case decided in 2022, so just 7 months ago, involving a praying football coach, a man called Joseph Kennedy, who would go to for a while was leading his own players in prayer after games, and would march to the 50-yard line after games and kneel down and say a prayer. And this was, he would say, meant to be a private moment of, personal prayer and everything. You can think of lots of places for privacy. The 50-yard line after a football game doesn't seem to be a great place for a private moment. The Supreme Court found that his free exercise rights were protected here in a misguided decision, in my view. I think the Supreme Court has done an admirable job of making the public school a type of sanctuary which is free from religious coercion in a series of decisions that date back to the 1960s. As many of you know, it was quite common to have prayer in schools. And that led to enormous trouble for religious minorities. And the Supreme Court in a series of decisions said you can't have official prayers in school or at graduation ceremonies or even at football games over a loudspeaker. And the Roberts Court is quite receptive to certain types of religious claims. And interestingly, they did, in the midst of this Kennedy decision, sort of try to draw back a bit on the Garcetti versus Ceballos case, which I mentioned a moment ago, because it seems, at least many people would say, that the Roberts Court is sympathetic to the religious speech that Joseph Kennedy is offering, and they would be perhaps, less receptive to other types of speech that did not sound religious in nature. But these are important, sort of clashes that happen where a school board is saying one thing and a teacher is saying something else, and there's often sort of conflict that arises in this area.
Yeah, this actually is a good occasion for me to maybe clarify a little bit what I meant about power dynamics. I mean, I was thinking from the perspective of a student, where if you're an 8-year-old who's, is looking up at this grown-up, or even a high schooler who can get detention if they step out of line, it's pretty simple who's got the power in that situation. Your teacher does. But of course, it's not that simple. And particularly as we have seen, these incredibly vitriolic school board sessions, social media, certainly in higher education where adjunctification and the kind of consumer model of delivering a student experience has become a really big problem. It's much more complicated than that. And I think we should be really aware of that at the K through 12 level as well. So it requires holding at least two things in your mind at once and thinking of, how free speech is experienced, or the right to free speech is experienced differently between teachers and students. And I think it's important to realize the teacher and the student might be the two parties that are in that classroom, but there's so many more parties and stakeholders who are shaping those interactions: parents, administrators, policymakers, the media, et cetera. And so, yeah, I think that's a dissatisfying answer in saying it's complicated.
So one of the things that came up in both of these case studies, both of these flashpoints that you brought forward, was the various different ways in which the limits of expression were being defined under the broad mandate of freedom of speech. Because of course sexuality and sex education and all sorts of kinds of issues related to personal identity are also issues of expression. And in the Tinker decision and dissent, I thought it was really interesting. The Tinker decision referred to freedom of speech as a way of protecting schools from becoming enclaves of totalitarianism. So speech is the freedom of speech is defined in opposition to totalitarianism. But then for Justice Black to come around and define freedom of speech as opposed to permissiveness, this dichotomy between permissiveness and totalitarianism had me thinking really broadly about what kinds of behaviors and actions fall under the mandate of free speech.
So it's a very perceptive question. The majority in Tinker and the dissent had lots of differences, but there was some area of overlap, and it's underappreciated, but they both viewed schools as creating citizens. You know, the majority had what I would regard as a robust conception of citizenship, including disputation and sort of mixing it up, and this being an important aspect of self-government and democracy. And I would regard Justice Black as having a sort of thin conception of citizenship. One might even say a report card conception of citizenship. You know, the grade for citizenship on your third grade report card where it's, you know, obedience, right, and sort of following directions and, you know, playing nicely with others and these sorts of things. So that is a real area of overlap. And it's important to note that students can't say whatever they wish whenever they wish, right? It's not as though, you know, getting up on one's desk in the middle of calculus class and reciting, you know, a Walt Whitman poem is going to be protected under the freedom of speech, which was what makes the black armbands in Tinker so ingenious, right? That it is not in any way disruptive. So it is important to know that the teachers have, you know, a difficult job, but they cannot suppress all forms of student speech. And if they were permitted to do so, it seems to me that students would take very dangerous lessons about what government can do. After all, most people have their first sustained contact with the government in the form of the public school, and the lessons that they take from that exposure, they will take with them for the rest of their lives.
It's a really important point about citizenship here. I mean, one of the reasons that I kind of picked the periodization that I did in doing this book, Classroom Wars, is because it ends in around 1978. But after that, you have the kind of rise of the full opt-out of public schools by a lot of conservatives, more religious schools, more homeschooling. And one of the things that was really distinct about this period is everybody agrees that you know, public schools are worth fighting for and that they're the places where citizens are made. And I think it's really relevant that in this sex ed battle, both sides are pointing the finger at the other one and saying, you're abetting this slide into totalitarianism. The pro-sex ed people think that this is, you know, like shutting down freedom of thought and freedom of exploration and the individualism of these kids in service of this kind of right-wing religious project, the people on those are the people on the right. The people on the other side are effectively saying the same thing, but just kind of flipping the script. I think it is also relevant on this point of citizenship that moral guidelines committee that I brought up, that Reagan convened and totally stacked with anti-sex ed people, the guidelines that they eventually come up with after about 2.5 years of deliberation say almost nothing of sex education, are all about citizenship, and I'll spare you the details, but the kind of conservatives that had stacked that committee, they submitted one document to the Board of Ed, and it was all full of like, secular humanism is going to take over, and we have to fight the communists, and we have to wave the flag, etc. It actually gets rejected, but it's all about patriotism nonetheless. The version that gets approved is also all about patriotism, but is much more spoken in this idiom of, we have this beautiful American project that has an unrealized promise. And so the point of schools is to teach kids about the beauty of that American potential, but also to make it quite clear that we haven't gotten there yet. And so I do think it's important to realize this kind of citizenship project, which is at the heart of all these questions, even the ones where it might not seem as obvious. Like, why is teaching about sex ed connected to citizenship? Well, it's only, I think, so controversial because it does assault certain folks' vision of what a citizen should be, and also, we didn't even talk about this, what vision their tax dollars are paying for, which is a major part of this discourse as well.
Thank you. So I had the remarkable opportunity to speak to these two before the panel, and I have many, 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 many questions, but I feel it's only fair for me to share their brilliance with all of you. So I'd like to open it up for questions. Just so you know, I will call hands as I see them, and I will read your question out into the microphone so we can hear it. Yeah.
I'll try to be brief. I'm sorry that I tend to talk a lot. Do you have any practical suggestions, an example of suggestion, at least in high schools? I'm sure in places, if they don't already, they have parents on school boards. But I would insist on having students on school boards saying that if you're a student, say you're uncomfortable with sexuality, well then, but you're an actual student, you may be for or against that. But that's an example of something that you could require, say at the Pennsylvania state level, saying that, well, at least the high school level, have students on the school board or some decision body because they're being affected by it. So if you have any suggestions like that. Thank you.
So the question was about practical suggestions for what school boards could do to better represent the voices of students, whether that's including student representatives on the school board.
I would absolutely say having students on school boards would be a really, really important step. I don't have an example at the ready for you, but you furnish exactly
I was a student representative on the school board back in 1971, 72, thereabouts.
Here we go.
I'm not sure I carried any weight, however.
Right, you have to worry about it being just sort of performative or token, but I do think that's really important. The other thing I think is important is, I've been incredibly dismayed at the kind of shallow discourse around parental rights and parental activism with schools recently. It's so unfortunate to me that there's been at least one very loud argument, which is like, oh, all these parents that want to say in their kids' education are necessarily anti-teacher and a kind of retrograde force in the civic project of education. Of course, that's true of some parents, but I think most of us who have worked in schools know that it's actually really important to have buy-in of parents and to have collaboration, and that parents have a host of different perspectives that are important to bring to the table. So that would be my answer to that one.
I'd like to just add something very brief here, which is to say I appreciate your drawing our attention to school boards. The cases that I write about in my book overwhelmingly involve the Supreme Court articulating a constitutional floor below which schools should not fall, cannot fall without violating the Constitution, but nothing prevents other actors, including school boards, from offering additional layers of protection that go beyond what the school board has done. And there are lots of instances that I do write about in the book of school boards or state legislatures or even state Supreme Courts interpreting state constitutions that do offer additional layers of protection. The school boards are really important. Indeed, Steve Bannon, a person that I have lots of disagreements with, has said that the key to reclaiming the nation runs through the school board. So these are, vitally important institutions in our society. He's right about that. He's right about the importance of school boards. I want to be very careful.
Thank you. So the notion of a heckler's veto, I was interested in hearing your thoughts with respect to institutions of higher education, some of which have been in the news, perhaps some of which are your own institutions, regarding student speech clashing with those of invited speakers.
So the question here is about the heckler's veto as it plays out in the context of higher education, when perhaps student protesters disrupt invited presentations on campus.
Yeah, so the heckler's veto is a very important phenomenon, and I do think that there is a real connection between what happens in the K through 12 environment and what happens on the college in the college environment. And I think that one of the reasons that we are seeing insufficient respect for free speech on college campuses can be traced to a failure to vindicate free speech rights in the K through 12 environment. The students bring these attitudes with them from their elementary and secondary school contexts. And so, in the book, I try to note some instances where courts have, in my view, heroically refused to accept a heckler's veto. I talk about a case out of Rhode Island involving, it's not a Supreme Court case, a lower court case involving a young man called Aaron Fricke. This is in either the late 1970s or very early 1980s, who wished to bring another young man to prom, right? He's gay. He wishes to bring a man to prom. And the school says, you can't do it. There's been some pushing and shoving about sexual orientation, and we can't guarantee your safety. And the district court judge says, nonsense, right? You cannot allow the mob to do this. And he is attempting to express his sexual orientation through his selection of a date. And you need to protect his free speech rights along this dimension. So that's a story that makes the left happy. There are other stories as well, though, that I am a person, I'm a liberal, but that, I think have been wrongly decided, including I write about a case out of California where there were some students who wished to wear clothing featuring the American flag and were told that they needed to turn their American flag shirts inside out. It was May the 5th, aka Cinco de Mayo, and some students of Mexican descent regarded themselves as being trolled and everything, right? And said, what's the matter, you don't like Mexicans? And there was some hostility. Now, I'm maybe somewhat sympathetic to the students who took exception, but there can't be a world where students are threatening violence upon their classmates for wearing American flag clothing. And the court got it wrong there in saying that it was permissible for the school just to tell these students to turn their American flags inside out. So the heckler's veto is a real problem in American schools, and I'm concerned about it, and I hope that the Roberts Court will offer additional protection for student speakers. The Tinker decision came down in 1969. That's a really long time ago, so it was a real step forward, but we have farther to go in order to vindicate student speech.
Johan?
Hi, thank you for this. I had a question that sort of builds on some of these themes, which is a lot of the conversation is focused on the free speech rights of students to take exception and to express that exception, how have courts understood, I mean, if one of the purposes of school and a democracy is socialization, not just the development of citizens as critical thinkers, but also as Americans, right? Culturally, normatively, socializing. How have the courts understood the authority of citizens through either their state or district representatives to engage in socialization? Because I think a lot of our debates over sex, gender, and race are not about the individual rights of a particular student, but about that capacity of schools to engage in socialization. And how is that understood within our system?
Yeah, very interesting question. I'll try and summarize it. So how do understandings of socialization as they apply to education shape discourse about sex education?
Yeah, in the law is what you asked. So I'm going to turn it over to Justin in a second. But let me answer one thing, because I do think this question of socialization is really important, even beyond sort of case law, because, it's inevitable that kids are being socialized to something when they're going to school, right? And, one of the things that really fires up anti-sex ed opponents at the time, but is still very relevant, is this notion that this is part of a kind of sensitivity training or mind control project where teachers are have undue influence in influencing children to do more than learn pure academic material. Now, they walk through the halls and they're learning more than pure academic material, but I think, I don't have an answer to the legal question, but I think it's important to realize how intensely contested that notion of what kind of socialization should happen far beyond anything you can see in reviewing a curriculum or a textbook is.
Yeah, this is a recurrent issue in American society, thinking about constraints and the efforts to socialize. There were lots of cases, including in the 1920s, dealing with assimilation. There were state laws that existed in lots of different places that forbade the teaching of foreign languages before a certain age. There was a lot of concern in the aftermath of World War I about Germans and people not learning English. And so in order to facilitate that, we're going to prohibit people from, not speaking English in the school context and everything. And this was something that had widespread appeal, including former President Teddy Roosevelt talked about, we're in danger of turning into a polyglot boarding house, right? That everybody's going to be speaking their own language, and there's going to be, an insufficient sort of lingua franca and everything. Supreme Court of the United States invalidated that measure in a case called Meyer versus Nebraska, in a really important decision. And there are similar cases as well from this same era, including one called Pierce versus Society of Sisters out of Oregon, where a measure that was backed by the Ku Klux Klan that sort of sought to require all students to attend public schools. Their concern with this was not black folks, but instead Catholics. And they thought that Catholic students attending their own schools was preventing them from becoming Americanized. And so they should be required to go to a public school where they will rub shoulders with American stock and things of this nature, right? Supreme Court of the United States said, nope, can't do it. States can require people to receive an education, but they cannot require them to go to public school. So these are recurrent issues, and of course, we can see them today as well. You can regard the anti-CRT movement as being an important aspect of sort of people being socialized in the wrong way, and that we're turning public schools, the claim would be, into hotbeds of radicalism and American hatred, right? That would be the claim that people who push this anti-CRT legislation, so that people are often interested in legal opposition to anti-CRT legislation. The truth is that it's an uphill battle because, for the reason that you cited, there's an incredible amount of local control over school curricula, right? The federal government and the courts have been very hesitant to get involved in this area. The one area, if I were advising people who were interested in challenging these sorts of lawsuits to contemplate exploring, would be a challenge under the notion of void for vagueness. This is a concept that if the person is uncertain as to whether they are violating the law in question, then it puts the person in a very awkward position, right? And some of these statutes, as I understand them, are written quite broadly to talk about harm and whether people feel uncomfortable. And boy, well, it's hard to know what's going to make someone feel uncomfortable, at least in the, if you're talking about slavery in the United States, that this is, that may be a source of discomfort, but some people would say that discomfort of some varieties can be a powerful educational force, right? It takes you outside of your comfort zone, makes you rethink things. So thanks for the question.
As a high school student myself, I found this panel very informative and relevant, but I'm curious how you all think the role of social media has and will continue to play on free speech and schools and in general.
So a great question, and not a little one. How does social media affect debates about free speech in schools?
First, I'm so happy that you're here as a high school student at an academic panel. I'm now going to put pressure on my own children to do the same. You'll never believe who I met today. I think it's such a great question, and I guess my answer to that would primarily be, speaking a little bit to the cheerleader case that Justin referred to, which is I think one of the most powerful impacts is the permeability of the schoolhouse gate. That now that we have these social media platforms, which allow you to be speaking about school issues, sometimes on school grounds or off school grounds, affecting school communities, it's very hard, it's much harder to kind of draw that bright line and say, hey, you had your feet on school property when you said this. That means that you're subject to one set of rules and expectations, as opposed to, well, you were Snapchatting about this at home, but everyone saw it on Monday morning. And so how can you say that doesn't have an effect on the way that a school community operates?
Yeah, it's a very important question with respect to social media. It seems to me that there should be lots of protection for student speech in that space. At the same time, I've said lots of things that are supportive of broad protections for student speech. I also want to recognize that schools are in a difficult position here. And that I think that even few people in this room would believe that students should be able to say, whatever they wish, including there can be, bullying and, sexual harassment, racial harassment, things of this nature. And it's actually incumbent upon the schools to step in some of these situations. And so it is a difficult needle to thread, but I would emphasize that there should be lots of protection for students to be able to, criticize, including school officials and everything, right? Or criticizing school policies. It seems to me that that's an especially important thing to protect because that's how young people are finding their voices. And if we just permit schools to suppress, so much speech, that we'll be in really bad shape as a constitutional democracy. And there are obviously lots of reasons for fear on that front. There are those who say that January 6th was an all too vivid lesson in the paucity of our civic education, right? And that people are insufficiently aware of the sort of, our rights and obligations in our constitutional democracy.
So we have time for, I think, just one last question.
I work at a small district. My name is Yvette Dunn. I work at a small school district, Oxford, PA, and it was disheartening to hear Kevin McCarthy, the new Speaker of the House, speak last night. In his speech, he basically said Democrats, the woke Democrats, are a threat to free speech, and that they are going to, Republicans are going to double down on fighting against CRT and other measures that have helped students to speak their truth. How do we combat that on the level of a board or school districts to remove the red and blue echo chambers where people who are locked in on Fox News or people who are locked in on MSNBC, and we don't have a lot of conversation outside of those echo chambers? How can we get back to what's best for the students politically? And I know that's
Yeah, so the question is about political polarization around education, reference to Kevin McCarthy's speech last night, and also the issue of anti-CRT and divisive concepts legislation, and thinking strategically about how we can push the politics of education back towards prioritizing the needs of the student.
It's such a great question. I really appreciate it because of the way you laid that out, of like the full scope of the issue. It's not just Kevin McCarthy railing against woke Democrats, but we have a political communication and polarization and lack of nuance crisis in this country, right? And that's not one party's problem, I don't think. I wish I had the answer to that. It's something that keeps me up at night. I mean, it depends on the community that you're in, but I mean, I teach a lot of seminar classes about culture wars, classroom wars, and something that I find really helpful is like unpacking a text together among a group where there's a presumption of kind of good faith engagement, whether that's a faculty meeting, like let's read Kevin McCarthy's speech and like what does he mean by woke Democrat, and kind of not in a pedantic way, but kind of saying like let's look at these sources, really understand them, and have this kind of critical conversation, because too often people are just like not doing the reading and jumping to whatever conclusion is most facilely like shoved at them, and that can be irresistible, but it's a huge problem. Combine that with a lack of civic education, which is also a huge problem, and then you get kind of where we are today. And so I think that there is a way to do this that doesn't slide into sort of an easy both sidesism, which is a problem, of course, but the challenge I think is nicely addressed in your question, which is like, let's try to do our best to look at this whole big problematic arena. But I think the answer is like, let's start with a text, with one article, with one kind of, thing, or a small set that we can kind of unpack and understand together. I would say that's the start.
Well, thank you all so much for coming to join us for this conversation today, which touched on all of the things I thought I would and more. Before I adjourn this session, I want to make sure to thank PEN America and the American Historical Association for hosting the event, and importantly, to our funder, the National Endowment for the Humanities. Always helpful to have funders. Thank you to all of our panelists. And I also want to express appreciation to Nikolai Mackenzie for a really beautiful reading earlier. And most importantly, thanks to all of you for being here today. Please fill out the survey cards that are being passed around and leave them on your seat. The information you provide is really, really helpful to us, and also in terms of going back to the funders to say whether we should have more of these events. If you have more to say and you're willing to be filmed, please see Kristen Treverdian directly to share a testimonial about the event. She can put you in front of a camera. Thank you again. Have a great day. And I'm sure if you'd like to come up and say hello to our wonderful panelists, they'd be happy to say hi to you. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.